Okay. Thanks, Stephen, for leading us in worship just now. Maybe not this. So, yeah, I'm going to be speaking tonight. It's been a while, actually. I've spoken at Roots a couple times, but it's been a long time since the last time. I don't remember when it was, maybe over a year ago. But I'm glad to be back up here and helping out. I enjoy the opportunity. And as Grant mentioned earlier with the scripture reading, so today in the Sunday morning service was what's called Youth Sunday, and it's pretty much what it sounds like. We have people in and involved with the youth ministries just kind of lead the Sunday service. So we had youth in the bands, we had youth doing ushering, like youth doing readings, and then I, as the youth pastor, gave the sermon instead of the regular pastor. And I chose to speak about Esther. And the main reason I chose that is that we had youth summer camp last month, about a month ago, and the topic of the week, it was all about the book of Esther. So I thought there was a lot of interesting, I don't know, I definitely learned some things. There was a good speaker at summer camp. I learned some things about Esther, and I think there are a lot of good points to take away from the book. So I'm going to try to go through the whole story, hopefully a little faster than I did this morning, and get some of these really good points out of the book for us. So who here has read the book of Esther? Anybody? Okay, some of us. And does anybody know the story of the book of Esther, kind of? Okay, so I'm glad the people who read the book also know the story. That's good. So, yeah, this is a book of the Old Testament. It's pretty short. It's 10 chapters, and the 10th chapter is one of the shortest chapters in the whole Bible, I think. The 10th one is very short. So it's basically 9 chapters, and it's telling this story that happened a long time ago, like everything in the Bible. But it's at an interesting part of church, well, not church, but Bible history. It's before Jesus by a long time, and it's involving the Jewish people, like the Old Testament does. It's at a period where they don't live in their kingdom anymore. They used to possess the land of Israel a long time ago, and then they got kicked out by some foreign invaders. They got captured by Babylon, and this is a little bit after that. So they were captured by Babylon, then Babylon gave way to Persia, and now the Persians are in charge of the Jews. So the people in our story are the king of Persia, another kind of official in Persia, and then 2 Jews, one of whom was taken in captivity a long time ago from his home country, and then a young girl, Esther herself. She's the niece of this other guy, and she must have been born in captivity based on her age. So she has never even known her home country. All she knows is what it's like to be born under Persian captivity. But yeah, that's kind of setting the stage a little bit. But I want to do our scripture reading, and then we'll look at the story a little bit and see what it means. So our scripture reading for tonight is Esther chapter 4, verses 13 through 16. And it says, "Then Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, 'Do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this?' Then Esther told them to reply to Mordecai, 'Go, gather all the Jews to be found in Susa, and hold a fast on my behalf, and do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my young women will also fast as you do. Then I will go to the king, though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish.'" So, that last word, perish, you heard that a couple of times. First, Mordecai says, "You and your father's house will perish," and then at the end she's saying, "If I perish, I perish." So why is everybody worried about dying? Well, there's several reasons for this that we're going to get into. But Esther finds herself in a really, really tough situation to make one of the hardest choices possible, probably much harder than any of us will ever have to make, fortunately, because we live in a much nicer time than she did. But yeah, she comes to this point in her life where she has to make this extremely difficult choice, and she has to decide, is she going to trust God to protect her even in this circumstance, or is she just going to kind of run away and hide? And this is definitely something that we can learn from, even if we do live in different circumstances. She is a pretty amazing example that can teach us some things about our identity in God and how to trust God. So, the way this book of Esther starts is we have this king Xerxes. He's the king of Persia, and he's kind of an interesting guy. He's definitely a very powerful man. He's in charge of, it says, 127 provinces on multiple continents. And at this time, he's the most powerful man in the world. He's in charge of the most powerful kingdom in the world. So he is a big deal. But he doesn't have it all figured out, as we'll see in the story. He has some issues of his own. So he's throwing this really, really gigantic, expensive, long party. The first phase of his party lasts 180 days. And then after the 180 days, there's another week-long feast after that. And he's throwing this party for like his noblemen, his officials, and representatives from the 127 provinces. Because he kind of just wants to show them that he's powerful and that he's rich and that he like treats people well who do what he says. And I'm sure he would also show them that you do not want to cross him. So he's throwing this really, really long party. And during the feast, the 7-day feast, he calls for his wife, whose name is Queen Vashti. He calls for her to come out in front of like him and a bunch of other guys, other officials or whoever, just to show them how beautiful she is. So what exactly that means, I'm not totally sure. I don't know if it's like something sketchier or if he literally just wants her to come like parade in front of them for a second or whatever. But the crazy thing that happens is she refuses to do it. And this is really like unheard of and unacceptable in that time. Again, this is the most powerful man in the world. Like when he says something, people do it or they probably die. Like you don't disobey the king of Persia in this time. So I think him and everyone else were very surprised. He tells her, come show your beauty off to my guys and me. She says, no, I'm not going to do it. That was completely unexpected. So he has to consult with his wise men about what he should do now that she's disobeying him. And the wise men say, we need to get rid of this queen, this disobedient queen, because if the word spreads that she disobeyed you, then all the wives and all the kingdom will stop obeying their husbands, and everything will fall into chaos. That's what his advisors tell him. I think it's kind of funny that that's like where their minds go immediately. But they say, yeah, if Vashti gets away with disobeying the king, then the whole kingdom's going to fall apart because wives will no longer obey their husbands. So he says, yeah, that sounds logical. I will get rid of her. So he banishes the queen for this one instance where she refuses to come show off how beautiful she is. So this leaves the king without a queen at all because that was her and now she's gone. So he has to find a new queen. And he asks his advisors again, how should he find a new queen? And they say, we'll go and gather up all of the most beautiful young virgin women from all the 127 provinces, and we'll just bring them to the palace and give them beauty treatments and make them as appealing as possible, and then just have like a giant contest to choose who's the best woman in the whole kingdom, and then she'll be the new queen. And I think it's kind of funny. It sounds kind of like a reality show or something. Or like, yeah, it just sounds like some sort of modern kind of contest reality thing, I feel like. But I guess that was a thing that could happen thousands of years ago as well. So they decide to do it, and they just go around the entire kingdom, a really, really huge kingdom, and they just take all the beautiful young women. And one of the beautiful young women is Esther. So she is an orphan. Her parents somehow died. It doesn't really say how they died. And she's being raised by her uncle. Her uncle's name is Mordecai, and he's old enough to have lived in Israel when he was younger. He was taken as a captive, so he knows what the old life was like. He also knows what it's like to live as a captive. And now he works for the king. He works as kind of like a guard of the gate. So it's not a really honorable or like impressive job. I mean, I'm sure it's an important job, but he's not like a really distinguished guy. He's just kind of like a common gate guard. But he is at the palace. So Esther gets taken to be part of the queen contest, and he tells Esther, like, you might not want to tell everybody that you're Jewish. There's definitely some baggage associated with being Jewish at the time. The Jews had like rocky relations with a lot of other countries. A lot of times, like really all throughout history, as well as at this time, Jews are not like the favorite people of other people in the world for some reason. People tend to kind of pile onto them. Honestly, it probably has a lot to do with them being the chosen people of God. But yeah, he was saying, don't tell everybody that you're Jewish, just keep that a secret because it might get you into trouble. So she doesn't tell anybody. So she goes through the whole queen contest. She goes through like a year of beauty treatments. She is compared to thousands of other young women, and she ends up being chosen to be the next queen. We don't really know, again, like it's hard to tell why she was chosen. I'm sure there were many, like you'd think there would be many like similarly beautiful women in the entire like 2-continent kingdom that they had going, but for some reason she was chosen. So I think honestly, of course, this was God working, as we'll see a little bit later, but she is chosen by the king. So now she's in this position of being queen, but kind of like the previous queen, she's not really that powerful, and she doesn't really have that much control or influence. It's like her title is queen, but she's kind of completely subject to whatever the king wants. And she can't cross the king or displease him, or else she could just be out of there, or even worse, she could be killed. So even though it might sound like being a queen is really powerful and great, she really kind of has to be on her toes still. And she also has to do whatever the king says whenever. So it's not the best position in the world, but also not the worst, I'm sure. Like, she doesn't have to worry about food. She doesn't have to worry about, like, her safety, I'm sure. She's probably very safe. So there are positives, but yeah, this is her life now. So one day during this new state of affairs, Esther is in, like, the queen's house in the palace. She has, like, her own living space. And Mordecai is still working at the gate. That's his job. He overhears a plot to kill the king. There's 2 other people who, for some reason, don't like King Xerxes. They want to kill him. So Mordecai is faithful in his duty, and he reports to Esther that there is a plot to kill the king. So Esther then tells other authorities, and they investigate to find out about this plot, and they do find that there are 2 other men who are trying to assassinate the king, and they take those men and they hang them. So now the king's life is saved, and the reason it was saved is because of Mordecai, the Jew. So that's like the significant thing that happens with Mordecai, but it doesn't really go anywhere. Like, he doesn't get much credit right now. He doesn't get honored or anything like that. It's just a thing that happens, and then the story moves on. So after this, a little bit later, we meet our other character. His name is Haman. And, Haman is like a nobleman in King Xerxes' court, and he ends up being the top nobleman, the most important one, the most powerful one. Again, for some reason, not really sure why, he's getting more promotions than the other noblemen. He's being given more power. He's being like put in higher and higher positions. And as he's getting these promotions, everyone in the kingdom is honoring him more and more. And they're essentially worshiping him. They're praising him. They're honoring him. They're bowing to him. But there's this one guy who refuses to honor Haman pretty much at all. And this guy is, again, Mordecai. Mordecai the Jew who works at the gate. He does not want to honor Haman at all because Haman is not his god and Haman is not his king. And he believes in like a strict policy, as a good Jew would, that he would only honor God and honor the king. So he refuses to worship Haman at all, or honor him really in any way. And Haman is completely furious about this, because Haman has a big ego, and he has like the promotions, he has the power, but he can't enjoy it while someone is disrespecting him. Like, that's how big his ego is. A little bit of disrespect basically ruins his entire life. So I think that's a pretty good example of how, like, having the bad perspective, just focusing on the one thing that's bad, kind of just ruins everything else that's good that he has going for him. So Haman decides that he wants to destroy Mordecai, and not only that, because that's not good enough for Haman, he wants to just destroy his whole family, destroy his whole people group. So Haman, he's a pretty powerful guy, he's in charge of a lot of things, but he still has to get the king's permission, kind of get him to sign off on things if they're really important. So he devises this plan to get the king to sign off on like a law that on a certain day of a certain month, everyone will be allowed to kill the Jews and take their property. Like, all the Jews in the entire kingdom, they're spread out in various places, like little communities of Jews. He's making a law that on this certain day, it will be legal to kill all the Jews and take their property. So he tells the king to get the law passed. He's like, oh yeah, these Jews are like scheming and they're disloyal and they're going to try to like rebel against you at some point. So we got to just like nip this problem in the bud and destroy them. And that's not true, of course. That's not what the Jews were doing. But Haman just tells that to the king. The king believes him, so he signs this law. So now suddenly there's a law on the books Just because Haman is mad at Mordecai, the one Jew who won't honor him, there's now a law that on a certain day in the future, it will be legal to kill all the Jews. That's what Haman is doing for his revenge, and it works. Like, the king signs off on it. I mean, it hasn't happened yet, but he succeeded in phase 1 of his plan. So, now Mordecai hears about this law, he hears that Haman got this done, and he knows that at some point in the future, all his people are going to be in grave danger. So he's very sad. He's like, I don't know if he's like afraid, not to say that he's not like trusting God per se, but he is very upset about this like looming thing in the future, this horrible event that is likely to take place. So Esther sees that he is so upset and that he's like mourning. Like in the Bible, sometimes they talk about people being in like sackcloth and ashes. Like there's a certain way of presenting yourself when you're mourning for something. And like you don't try to look good, you don't clean yourself, you just kind of look depressed and sad all the time. And that's what he was doing. And he's mourning in advance. He's mourning for the future loss of his people. They haven't died yet, but they're going to die if something doesn't change. So Esther is like, hey, Mordecai. She can't talk to him directly because their position is too different. She's like way up here and he's way down here. So she sends a servant to talk to him for her. She has to have like a go-between. So she sends a servant to be like, hey, Mordecai, what's wrong? Why are you so sad? He sends the servant back to say, well, it turns out this guy Haman is trying to kill us and our entire family. And unless you do something, it's going to happen. And she, being the queen, again, she doesn't have that much power. She can't just do whatever she wants, but she's definitely in a better position to do something about this than any other Jew in the entire kingdom. She is the highest ranking like Jewish person of anyone in the kingdom. So he says, you're really the only person who could possibly do something about this. So she says back to him, well, I'd like to do something about it, but there's this law that if you go to talk to the king without being invited by him and he doesn't want to talk to you, he'll just have you executed right then and there. So you can't, even the queen, this law applies to everybody. The only people who talk to the king are the ones who the king invites to talk to him. So if she wants to go talk to him about this, uninvited, she risks her life to do so. She can't just do, it's kind of funny because she's his wife, she's the queen, but she can't just show up in front of him. This would apply to her as well. So she's understandably a little bit afraid to do this. So what he says to her in response is the verse that we read at the beginning. He says, look, if you don't do anything, then you're probably going to die anyway, because the thing Haman has going on, he's allowed to kill all of us, and that even includes you. But perhaps for this very reason, this is why God put you here in this position, why he made you a queen, so that you could do something about this very instance. So again, like, she doesn't know that 100% for sure. Like, it's not God telling her in a vision, this is why I put you here. It's really just Mordecai. Like, he's not God. He's a godly man, but he's not infallible. He says, maybe this is why God put you here. So she still has to exercise a lot of faith here. It's not guaranteed at all. For all she knows, she could go before the king, and he's like, I don't want to talk to you, and then she gets killed. That could easily have happened as far as she knows. So she's wrestling with this really tough choice. She can try to do something about it, which could very easily fail, or she could just do nothing and watch this horrible event unfold, knowing that she didn't do anything to stop it. But fortunately, Esther does follow the advice of her uncle Mordecai. She takes it upon herself to go before the king uninvited, despite the risks. And she just goes and tries to enter his court and talk to him. And fortunately, he does not decide to have her executed. He does this thing where if he extends the scepter to somebody, that means they're allowed to live. So Esther comes before him, he extends the scepter, and she's allowed to talk to him. So, obviously what Esther wants to tell him is that all her people are going to be killed soon unless they do something about it. But she doesn't tell him right away. And it's possible that she was afraid to tell him, and it's possible that she wanted to work her way up to it or get him in a good mood or whatever. But when she first comes before him, he says, okay, what do you want? And instead of telling him what she really wants, she says, I would like for you and Haman, the guy who's causing all the trouble, to come to a meal at my house tomorrow. So the king's like, okay, sure, we'll do that. And the king kind of knows what's going on here. He probably knows that she's working her way up to asking something, but he plays along with it, and he is willing to go and be in her house and have a meal with her. So at the same time, Haman is still, he still hates Mordecai. Mordecai is still refusing to honor him the way he feels he should be honored. So he still wants to do something really terrible to Mordecai. So he talks to his family, and they have this idea that they should build a 75-foot-high gallows to hang Mordecai on when the day comes where they're allowed to kill all the Jews. So this is Haman's plan to go to deal with Mordecai, in addition to killing his entire family. But he still needs permission from the king. So the next morning, Haman goes to the king and wants to ask him, can I kill Mordecai and hang him on these 75-foot-tall gallows? But before he's able to ask, the king asks him a question. And he says, Haman, what is the highest honor that we can bestow upon a person? And Haman is so conceited that he thinks, oh, the king must be trying to honor me, so I'll make this really good so that he'll do something awesome for me. So Haman comes up with this whole plan about, like, if you want to honor somebody, you should throw them a parade and put them on your horse and dress them in your robes and make somebody shout out about how great they are. So then the king, he says, okay, that's a great idea. That's a great way to honor somebody. Now I want you to do all of those things for Mordecai, the Jew. And the reason he says this is because he's remembered that Mordecai saved his life earlier. A few chapters earlier in the book, Mordecai foiled the plot to kill the king, and now the king has finally gotten around to honoring Mordecai. So now, it's pretty crazy. Like, the same day that Haman was going to kill Mordecai, he's now been forced to honor Mordecai. So this is another example of how Mordecai was trying to be faithful to God, even though it could have dire consequences. Like, he didn't know it would work out for the best, but he was just trying to be faithful and saying, I'm only supposed to honor God. That's what God has told me to do. So even though this guy Haman is powerful and he's dangerous and he's telling me to worship him, I'm only going to worship my God, and I'm going to trust God to see me through the situation. And obviously that paid off completely. Like, instead of being killed, he's suddenly being honored. So a couple more things in the story and then we'll be wrapping up. So remember, Esther had invited the king and invited Haman to lunch. So the very same day that Haman is forced to honor his mortal enemy Mordecai, he then goes to lunch with Esther and the king. And the king knows that Esther wants to make a request. He kind of gets that vibe from her. So he tells her during lunch, he's like, okay, what do you really want to ask me about? Because I know it's not just about having a lunch date. I know you want to ask me something. So she finally works up the courage, or feels that the time is right, or whatever it is, and she says, there's somebody among your noblemen who's trying to kill all of my people and even kill me. So the king he doesn't understand, he doesn't know that Esther's Jewish, he doesn't really know what's going on, and when he hears this, he's completely furious that someone's trying to do this to his queen. He does still like her, even though they might have kind of a weird relationship where he has all the power, but he does still like Esther. So he's very upset that someone's trying to do this to his queen, and he says, who is it who's trying to destroy your people and destroy you? Who would dare to do this to the king's own queen and her people? And then she says, with Haman right there in the room, she says, it was Haman who tried to do this. I think she says, like, the villainous Haman or something cool like that. So suddenly, not only did Haman have to honor his worst enemy who he was trying to destroy, now he's being, like, called out for his horrible treachery right in front of the king. So in this story, we see the man who is trying to destroy God's people. He goes from the highest of high positions, and then he's brought completely low. Later, like in tragic irony, or I guess not tragic if you're a Jew, Haman himself is hung on the 75-foot gallows that he made for Mordecai because he was acting against the queen and her people. So, I don't know, I guess that's kind of like making your bed and lying in it, except it's like building your gallows and being hung on them. So the thing that he was trying to do to his enemy ended up happening to him. And then on the other hand, the people who have no power, who have no position, even Esther herself as queen doesn't have very much power. It's all the king. She just has to do whatever he says. God still honors them for being faithful, and he gets them out of this terrible, horrible situation where they all would have died. He delivers them at the last minute, and he shows that he really is faithful to them. So it's a really amazing story about how it's just kind of crazy how bad things can look at times, and how oftentimes trying to make the choices that honor God, it doesn't seem like it pays off sometimes. Sometimes it seems like it only gets you into more trouble. Maybe it like makes people not like you more. Maybe it just like causes inconveniences for you and other people, and it's like, man, do I really have to make this choice that God is asking me to make? Is that really going to pay off in the long run, or is it just going to be an inconvenience? But in this story, in a very extreme example, we see how even when it was at a great risk to their personal safety even, Esther and Mordecai make the right choices that God is asking them to make, and he does come through in the end. He does prove faithful to them, and he saves them. So, we've already talked about a couple of the kind of things you can get from this story, but I just want to touch on the thing that Mordecai said really quick before we wrap up, or as we wrap up. So, Mordecai said to Esther, perhaps God put you in this place for such a time as this. Maybe that's why he made you queen, so you could save all of us. And the same thing can apply to us in many ways, even if we're not going to stop a genocide or we're not going to become the queen of Persia. There still are situations where God put you there for a reason. And it might not be life or death, etc., but maybe God put you in someone's life so that you could have a conversation with them about God, or even tell them the gospel, or maybe just comfort them, or help to see them through a difficult time in their life. There's all kinds of situations that God might lead you to. You might find yourself with an opportunity to help someone or to love someone, and it's like perhaps God put you there for that very reason, to prepare you to do this thing, but you still have a choice. Are you going to do the thing that God has asked you to do, or are you going to make excuses for why you shouldn't do it and just walk away from the situation? But I think the book of Esther shows, and many other passages from the Bible, as well as real-life experience, they show that when you do make yourself available to God and you choose the choice that he is laying in front of you for the proper choice, he will honor that, and he will see you through difficult situations and then also provide beyond what you can imagine. So I'm going to close us in prayer. And after that, I'll close us in prayer, and then we're actually going to have... Do you think we should still do group prayer? I know it's been a long time.
Do the Lord's Prayer.
Okay, then I'm going to close us in prayer and lead us into the Lord's Prayer, and then we'll go back to worship. So let's pray. God, thank you very much for a good Sunday night tonight. Thanks that we have this service roots. Thanks for all the work that people, especially Grant, do to keep this service running. And thank you that we have this larger church that supports us, God, that we have this nice building to be in. So many physical things, God, but even more than those types of blessings, thank you for the spiritual blessings you give us, God, that you give us your word, that you give us just the love that we have from you and with each other, God. Please help us to learn from your word and to prioritize it, God, and not to just forget about it and look at it occasionally or listen to someone talk about it once in a while. But please help us to realize the amazing gift of your word that you've given us and to learn the principles of life that come out of it, God, and apply them to our lives. Thank you so much for blessing us so richly in so many ways. And please help us, God, when you have put us in a particular situation to accomplish something that you would like for us to accomplish, please help us not to shy away from it, God, but to rise to the challenge readily and know that you're going to strengthen us for the things you've prepared us for. It's not just about us and how great we are, God, but if we trust you and make ourselves available and are open to your power working through us, God, you will do amazing things with us. All right, guys, let's pray the prayer that Jesus taught us to pray. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen.